think Mr. Bagler said it very clearly, this is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of the process. We will gradually refine this. But we have to build, and we have to move on. And we have to move on three main fronts. We have to look a bit, the concept. Is the concept becoming clear? Are the key ingredients, the key building blocks of what the TALD approach to local development is? Are we clear on what is the difference with past approaches? We don't have to be clear at 100%, but are we seeing the ingredients more and more coming out? And do you see elements here where you're really saying, oh, this conceptually and still not clear? Can we have a first set of reactions on the conceptual issues? Is this something you can buy in, you can link to? You think you can also sell it to the delegations? Do we have the key ingredients there? So first set of questions would be to you on the concept. Later on, when we have done this tour, the table, on the concepts, I think it's very important, because then we can indeed look at the operationalization. And there, I think, Leonardo, you had a lot of elements, also our friends, the two discussants, on what it takes to promote TALD in very different settings. Elena, you are right, there is not one package. It all depends on the context. You will have to assess in what state we are, the opportunities, all kind of things. Okay, that's the operationalization, second block. And then third block, maybe suggestions on how to take this forward. Because you have here many different actors, so it would be good to have a continuum in this process. Let's maybe go to the first set of questions. The conceptual clarification, really an aim of this session. We had three presentations. Reactions, please. You relate to this, you recognize it, you see the added value. Here we are really in the concept, the strategy. Okay? Yeah,
I just wanted to say one thing, maybe to get the ball rolling. The first message here, for me at least, it was we have been supporting decentralization reforms over the last 20 years worldwide. There have been attempts to measure the effect of decentralization reforms on local development, on developmental outcomes. These efforts we did ourselves for DFID some time ago, a review of the literature on this. And they are, the literature is inconclusive. We cannot say, I mean, there is a lot of controversy on methodological, but also in terms of content, what this effect has been. What we are trying to say here, I mean, what has been my point all over is maybe it will be difficult to measure the effect of decentralization on local development. If we want to proceed in that direction, however, we first should have an idea of the conceptual linkages between them. Then we can start measuring properly. I have seen a number of econometric studies that trying to measure decentralization without recognizing that there was no decentralization to begin with. So my basic point is this. First, let's recognize conceptually the linkages. Second, let's recognize that decentralization reforms are not per se created to promote development, or to promote local development. Many of them fail to promote local development simply because they were not designed for it. Third thing, let's see what are what is missing, therefore, when decentralization reforms would have a chance to result in local development. And the answer to that question is, what we try to give as an answer is, if there is some kind of national development policy which has the feature of a territorial approach to local development, a TALD. If there is a national development policy which has those features, which has those characteristics, which, incomplete as it may be, but, partial as it may be, but there is a concern, and the government action is guided by that, then we may have a chance of producing local development. So, to summarize, if it's true that decentralization is driven by politics, what are the features of decentralization reforms driven by local development? What should we see, or what should we help government to do if we want to translate decentralization reforms into development, if we want to accomplish the promises of decentralization reforms for development? This is what we are trying to discuss here, and I would like to have your inputs on that. I try to provide a framework with the different building blocks of this development policy that must be there to an extent or another in order to have decentralization result in development outcomes. So please, refer to this and give us your inputs, your comments, your criticism with respect to this theme. We can touch on a number of things, but let's try to focus. The essence of the discussion should be this: what kind of national policy commitment must be there in order to make sure that decentralization reforms have a chance of translating into developmental outcomes, and what can we do to advocate that policy commitment and help build the different elements, the different components of that policy commitment. Policies, institutions, techniques, the whole bulk. I mean, the whole set of policy, institutional, and technical development needed to give a sense to this policy commitment, to make it sure that it is there. Because if we do not work on that, and we work on decentralization reforms per se, using the traditional fiscal federalism approach, which has dominated the external advice to decentralizing governments worldwide, if we keep doing that, if we keep to remain prisoner of the standard fiscal decentralization, fiscal federalism of the past, we will not actually even touch the real issue, which is not one of internal restructuring of the state. It is to allow, of course, but not. It's not the whole story, and it's not. And it's a story that can be driven by things that have nothing to do with development.
Very clear. Very clear. Thank you for specifying even the focus of this. And the communication is empowering local authorities for better development outcomes. So that's a clear link with this. Okay, reactions, please. So yes, Jorge and others.
Maybe to take the floor of this last intervention, because in fact this finding meets what we have found from 2012 in all the wave of regional decentralization seminars. A lot of delegations in countries that where we have been supporting decentralization reforms from here are very frustrated. Because
frustrated,
yes, because they see that this support goes nowhere, because there is not political will, because elites are very scared of local dynamics.
Like in the Cameroon case.
And in many situations, what is going to happen now, there is this paradigm shift between the decentralization and the local development. In context where decentralization reform are frozen, doesn't evolve, we cannot carry on supporting national reforms with an elite that doesn't want these reforms, even if the elite has adopted a rhetoric with saying that decentralization is for local development. Then in these cases, we have more and more examples where we have begin the house from the bottom, saying, okay, let's play with this framework, because it's the framework that exists. Let's apply it at bottom level, and this kind of approach means that we use a project approach like a kind of laboratory. With the outcomes that we look for are not only schools, hospitals, and so on, or local economic development pilot by local governments with other stakeholders, but also lessons, evidence of what works, what hasn't worked, because obviously the potential of this local development lies also of a conductive decentralization reform. But instead of supporting from the national level, and many delegations begin to do that, and understood his role as a kind of facilitator of a multi-actor dialogue between the actors that are piloting this local development experience in a given framework, just to see how this framework can evolve to be more conducive to local development. And it quite be very interesting with this dialogue, instead of being between the national government and the donors, is between national government and the local stakeholders that are supported by local evidence and local findings.
Thank you. We take other reactions, please. We have different stakeholders here. Because that's yes. Let's build a shared understanding of why this is important and what to focus on.
I'm also of these believers and thinkers that the EU should not mix up with the decentralization policies of the countries, because it is a high political issue and we don't have the resources in EU delegations and the sources of contractual agents to realize such a high profile and high interest political dialogue for the decentralization of the country. If we can help, so for me, I mean, as a program for the empowering the local authorities and so on, what we can do with the limited amount of money is to build bottom-up approach, build capacity building in the local authorities or the civil society, and when their institutions work, become more efficient, it is already a big contribution to the development of the territorial development of the country. I thought also, instead of the local authorities to wait the decentralization reforms of the top level to come realized after 20 years or 40 years, is to help the capacity of local authorities to collect their own taxes. And if at least they receive the permission, they achieve with the top government to collect, like here they are doing in Europe, the local authorities, what they're doing, or the regions, they collect, they are entitled to collect money from the houses and from the enterprises that are installed in the territory. And this is the main revenue of the regions and the local authorities. If in the developing countries they could achieve the same, at least to be entitled, the local authorities and the regions, to collect the local taxes from the housing, from the enterprise installing, business license, or they have a lot of open markets in these countries.
Yes.
If they collect the rights of these people that they want to trade in open markets, and they have to register to collect their taxes. Also, we can be inspired for the territorial development from the tool that was developed in Europe by DG Regio for the smart specialization. So what the DG Regio did for allocating the structural funds, they say, we take a region, okay, it has some sub-territories there. We are not going to develop tourism in all the territories, but we are mapping what are the resources of each territory. and we will see how we can exploit the. So not all the regions they develop, for instance, fishing, or all the regions they develop tourism, but each territory develops the product for development, its development, that has added value, and in collaboration with the other territories. Thank you.
Sorry, you went to the bathroom, so please go ahead with the next question. Thank you.
I profit that the microphone is close to me. Perhaps a perspective from indeed DG regional policy. But first of all, I think it's very interesting what you produced. Also that it shows that actually our thinking is very much the same, as evolved. Probably we are citing the same authors and things like that. Just wanted to share with you some conceptual thinking which is behind regional policy. I'm not sure if it is very relevant for you, but perhaps it is. First, I think you very well started with this, that actually we also start this territorial thinking from an analysis of sort of potential and challenges over territory. Actually, I only wanted to focus on some things that I thought that you did not mention that much. So all the rest that I don't mention is more or less because you already mentioned it before. So the starting point as an analysis, and then focus in on actually functional territories. So if you have a potential somewhere, a territory somewhere that you need to address in an integrated way, then you think your territorial approach should focus on that. So it should not be necessarily everywhere. According to us, it should have a sense. That also means that it not necessarily is local. It can only also be on other territorial scales. So, for example, also in cohesion policy, for several years, we have now territorial cooperation programs that focus especially on border areas, because certain specificities are really there. You can even go to macro-regional levels, like the strategy for the Baltic Sea, which you can have as many local things or strategies you want to never solve the problem, what is really specific to the region there, and sort of very polluted sea you have in the Baltic. So everyone would need to focus on that territorial issue to address it together. We also, if we speak about strategies, we'd like to speak about perhaps holistic strategies or integrated strategies, where it is not only economical, but we also insist, especially for cities, to also include environmental, demographic, and social elements, to avoid that that it will be a nice strategy, but which completely ignores other important aspects. Because of a territorial approach, a very important element is this sort of this cross-sectoral approach that we'd like to promote. And then if you go also to have this place-based approach, another element that I didn't hear that much about is that according to us, it also implies that to avoid that all these territories start doing sort of the same things, that you need to have sort of a vertical connection to other higher level strategies, but at the same time also exchange of experience and cooperation between these local actors and between local strategies perhaps is also an important element that we'd like to promote. Another point which is now in the regulations very much for community like local development, which is I think the way that what you are discussing today. An interesting point is that it actually cannot be, now according to the regulations, only publicly driven. Actually, the public authorities can only have 50% minus one vote of local action plans, local action groups, I think is the word, to really promote that it is not only public sector driven, but that the local stakeholders are actively involved. So that's also a crucial point. Something which is not actually coming back in the regulation, but what I heard in been also discussing it, and actually some studies that we do, is that perhaps also local leadership is very important in the process. It's not mentioned that far. You can have perhaps everything in place, but if no one takes the lead or the political risk to do something, to change something, then it might also be and I can share also some difficulties that we now have, but perhaps for but that's would be perhaps the next one.
That's the next.
Just for the concept from my part. Thanks.
Thank you. Our friends of the Committee of the Regions and Mr. Wagner.
As a committee, for sure, we value to support decentralization, ask for deeper decentralization. But I will not say that, or I will be careful between the identification or equal between decentralization and territorial reform or territorial development. I mean, it's not the same thing. In my country, my island, we spend time on institutional creation, meaning do we have the correct capacities, the correct competencies at local level to do that or to do this? Nice, very good. And we should promote a minimum competencies at local and regional level to have the capacity to have a strategy and the institution. But what I would like to underline is the fact that we should avoid to have a kind of identification between these two concepts. I mean, one is decentralization, the other one is territorial development. And
Okay, these are contributions. Let's see together, Mr. Baggio, and then we go to Virginia. Please.
Yeah, I think we start having a quite good conceptual approach. Perhaps, and this is about the contribution of our friends from Cameroon, perhaps a more stronger contribution on the aspect linked with social capital aspects, with leadership analysis, and for coming back to what our colleague from Regio said as well, can help. I think we have a quite good institutional definition in conceptual term. Perhaps there is this aspect which is for the moment lacking. The other aspect that clearly these are approaches that are floating around since now at least 40 years. I myself, as I'm not so young, I remember that we have started in DG Regio, by the way. I was working for DG Regio, the territorial programs. It was in the middle of the 80s. We had experience such as territorial pact, integrated approach, and so on and so forth. And the question is that it has never become a mainstream in terms of policy. It has always been a marginal thinking, which didn't have the capacity to really influence the structural policies, which continue to be very much sectorial, hardware-based, or if it is not hardware-based, it's software-based, but in a silo. And we continue since 40 years to say, we need to go out of the silo, we need more integrated approach, but at the same time this do not happen. So the question that will be raised in any case is, why? First, are you coming back on this thing, which can be at the best seen as nice and pathetic, but from experience not working proposal, because too intellectual, too difficult whatsoever. So maybe there is another aspect which could be relevant when we will define our guidance, is to anticipate the contradiction. So the moment we do not have this element. What I would not like is to be seen as a faith-based activist. I believe in something, so I'll put forward what I'm saying, but without having a rational for contradiction. But the main question for me is why, after 40 years of promoting, I mean, not just individually, but a certain number of people have pushed forward this kind of because they are convinced that this can work better than what is done. Why this today has not yet been considered as a mainstream approach? This is the same question that we will have to answer to all our colleagues in Geographic Directorate, by the way.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. It's better to anticipate this kind of questions. I'm sure Leonardo has maybe also another. Virginia, and then, Virginia, please.
Yes, I have a question in my mind since a number of years. Why we call this territorial approach? So let me formulate it. I shouldn't, but is this a concept that is clear for everybody, speaks to everybody, or not? So I have some doubts on the capacity to communicate beyond this room and beyond this community who believes into it. What is the key ingredients into it? And this is also because I see another concept coming up quite strongly now. It's about partnerships. So if you look at all what happens around the post-2015 debates, you hear a lot about innovative new type of partnerships. Are these partnerships at, I would say, local level very close to the territorial approach? Or I think it will be important not to lose the train of the post-2015 and to make sure that the concepts are clear and I would say take possible advantage of these big debates going on, where clearly local authorities are there, are vocal and participate, but use a concept that's up to time and well digested.
Thank you for making the link with post-2015 and sustainable development goal number 11, I think. Yes, what's the other hands here? Yeah, please. I'm sure you also triggered by the questions of why you have, is it still marginal?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's marginal anymore, but let me just start with the whole issue of decentralization and go back to the question of is this marginal, not marginal, why do we call it territorial, don't call it something else? I'll be a bit more bold than Leonardo has been. I think that decentralization, the way it has been done in the developing world, not in the developed world, has been an absolute disaster for development. And I'll agree with you, we need to make the distinction between one thing is decentralization, the other thing is development, and they're not the same. And why is that? Is it because decentralization per se is bad for development? No. It's the way decentralization has been done. It has been done mainly top-down, in which national governments have done basically decentralized powers, but not decentralized resources. And within powers, they have decentralized those powers that were more difficult to fulfill at the national level. So you have subnational levels with very often very little demand for decentralization, with no resources, unfunded mandates, and with a limited capacity, actually trying to do things for which they are ill-prepared and have no resources. Having said that, when does it work? Well, despite the fact that very often what we have had is this discourse, mainly promoted by national elites, that decentralization, we do it because it's going to bring development. What have we learned? That in some cases decentralization might work, but it works fundamentally based on going back to the agenda that was presented by Leonardo, when you have, let's say, budgetary resources. And here we know that it's much better to build, as we were saying, on local taxation than to build on transfers. And if we're going to do transfers, if you do it like in Mexico, where the majority of your decentralization, your money coming from the national government for education goes to pay salaries, you're doing no decentralization whatsoever. You need to rely on local taxation. But that local taxation, in order to increase transparency and control and accountability, needs to come from real taxation, work taxation, not taxation on the basis of national resources. Then you end up in the situation of Peru or Colombia or Indonesia, in which you have regions which are awash with money, and you don't know what to do with the money, regions that have no resources whatsoever. And of course, in Indonesia, you end up with the situation that parts of Kalimantan, we have to build in 3 or 4 stadia, and parts of Java haven't got anything. Second thing, when you're going to decentralize, what you need also is to make sure that not just that you also decentralize once there's demand, and to places where it's demand. It's better to pilot certain regions than to do it blanket to the whole of the country where some parts are not developed. If you have those two combinations, the likelihood that decentralization is going to be associated with a development agenda is going to be much greater. Why is this not mainstream? Well, as I said, I think this is becoming mainstream. I think this is becoming mainstream because, well, the biggest development policy in the world, which is the regional development policy, has gone place-based or territorial-based. However, having said that, why did it not become mainstream before? Well, because you have a certain level of path dependency. And you have that structures, governments at the national level, at the European level, at the international level, function very often in sectoral terms. And you intervene like that. The problem is, we know we can no longer go in that way. This is not a question for believers. It's a question that the previous paradigm has not worked. Let's take a look at the European Union. What has the European Union cohesion policy done? Well, it has worked to a certain extent. I'm not going to say it hasn't. It has paved the whole of Europe, especially the whole of the periphery of Europe, in roads and all sorts of infrastructure. To the extent that countries that were laggards, Portugal, Spain, for example, Portugal has now got the best motorway network in the world. And it's not just above the European average, it's 3 times the European average in per capita terms. Has that led to any sort of development? No, because the policy, the strategy was not integrated. It was the idea that we build something that is visible for political reasons, perhaps also economic reasons, that is going to make a difference. We know that that alone does not work. You need infrastructure to grow, but you need infrastructure that's commensurate to your human capital levels, to your capacity to attracting more investment, to your overall economic fabric, to your structure. And if you build that, we are realizing that this is the way to go forward, and that we cannot do big leaps. So this is also becoming mainstream. When we mention that the country where most economists are saying we should not intervene, the US, is now seriously thinking about establishing a national development policy at a territorial level. We're talking about a big shift in which politicians and society as a whole is starting to think perhaps we should do something in a different way because the way we have been doing things is not working. And the question of how do we call it? Do we call it territorial? Do we call it place-based? It deals with territories. The main focus is we don't say let's do and promote certain sectors. Certain sectors are going to be located somewhere. Which is going to look at actually the spatial dimension, saying what is it that you have in this city, in this region, in this territory that may allow it to grow and to grow in a sustainable way. And that's fine. Whether we can find a better moniker is another issue.
Thank you. Voilà, we still have time for a second round. Yes, I did.
On this issue of whether it is mainstream or not, I also think that is becoming mainstream. And I would say the difference, decentralization reforms that have happened worldwide have in a sense made a difference, at least in creating the opportunity for this to become mainstream. Problem is, and the most relevant question is the kind of response of the EU helping it becoming mainstream, or actually helping to stay marginal. Because when I see how the resources of the EU for international cooperation are programmed, when I see the multi-year investment programs, when I see the approach to the budget support for different sectors. Then I say, oh my goodness, there couldn't be anything more sectoral and less conducive to an integrated perspective in programming resources than what the EU is doing. So the problem is actually not that it's not becoming mainstream. If there wasn't, if there had not been, 20 years of decentralization reform, one could say maybe yes, okay, well, this is non-mainstream. But 20 years later, decentralization has been done very badly, and I agree entirely with Andres. But and I have been saying, and we have been saying that decentralization, when it happens, and it happens for political reasons, it's like a door opening. Then you can do something with it. Then you can take or not take advantage of it. Then you can steer it in one direction or the other. And what has been missing is the ability to take advantage of this. So I would rather focus on how we can help international assistance support territorial approaches which are trying to become mainstream, because it's not a matter of fate or will, being more or less inclined to there are fundamental economic realities that call for that particular approach. The example of Portugal that has spent so much in infrastructure and then cannot make use of it, and actually I understand that because of the crisis now those highways on which you pay toll are underutilized, which means very inefficient use of capital. Very inefficient use of capital. A lot of money on the ground, which could have been used much differently. What we are saying is this. It's unfortunate that we couldn't do the whole presentation, but what we're saying is it's a new. It's not. Once we go beyond the idea that we should not care about spatial equity. When we say yes, we should, because actually it has an effect on growth, which is important. Then the issue is how we deal with them, and the old, top-down, throw a lot of money for infrastructure to whoever wants it. Those approaches have failed. We need a different approach, much more selective, based on comparative advantage of territories, based on prioritizing investments, still to connect the space to the global economy, and go beyond the capital cities. And make use of those resources which are unutilized, as Andres has pointed out in his presentation. So I think that this is more the issue: how we can help this become, not help become mainstream. How can we become mainstream? How we can mainstream it in our own practice.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have still 20 minutes, so waiting for wrap up. This is not the end of the discussion, but it's good that we have a second round of inputs. I think it's very rich what we collect here to advance also the concept and what it means in practice. Second round, other remarks, other questions, other inputs?
For the second one, maybe I would be interested to a bit, if there is a bit of elaboration about the size. Huh? I mean, 50, we spoke about cities. Can we, and I'm already thinking about the future guidance, the next steps. Should we advise to look into the space in terms of square kilometers or number of inhabitants? Make a relationship, for example, between the size of the population and the existence of not of an institution linked to this size of this territory, or should we promote other kind of concept as some time ago the notion of bassets, more than institutional realities, employment basin, industrial basin, natural space or whatsoever, as one of the entry points. Considering obviously that all what we have discussed is validated and so on and so forth, at a certain point we need to start piloting. What is the size of what we want to do?
The feasible size. Okay. You want me to react to this?
No, I am, but I don't want to.
Madam, please.
Yeah, I would like exactly to build on this last point, because I come from a geographical region that is particularly complicated, the neighborhood south. The neighborhood south.
The neighborhood south.
Yeah.
That's not
Yeah, it is quite complicated because of the nature of the countries themselves. And I give you two examples. You have Egypt, which is huge, highly differentiated, definitely centralized, now with the military back in power. So it's difficult in that case to talk about even decentralization. There were some attempts before the revolution, but now that is not the trend anymore. But the challenges at local level are huge, and it's also a matter of political stability, of security, of development. We're all well aware of the challenges at local level that need a response. And the response given by the central level, including also our kind of cooperation, which is basically nation-centered, probably is not the best answer. And another example for Lebanon. Lebanon, 4 million people, completely different from Egypt, highly differentiated with 18 religions. Out of a population of 4 million, you have 2 million of Syrian refugees. Lebanese and Syrian, they hate each other. They are competing for jobs at local level. They are competing on religion. Plus, you have the Palestinians coming from the creation of the State of Israel. So you see, it's quite complicated also to manage. You have a central government that is not existing in the sense that is not empowered enough to carry out even their own national policies, imagine even worse decentralization. So my question is, what do in context like this? Because the challenges are huge, and it's also, again, in the case of Lebanon, it's a bomb that can explode, and probably the best response could be at local level. Can in that case, for example, what Mr. Paolo was saying before, the basins or local economic development could be kind of answers that we can try to promote. And I want to go to another point concerning the partnership, the different kind of partnership. Is in more developed concepts of local development. Can we strategically build, as European Union as a whole, so in our member states, a partnership between the local territories in developing countries and our own local territories in Europe, which can have some comparative territorial advantages that we can exchange with our partners in developing countries. So moving also towards decentralized cooperation. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. One more, two more. The neighbor, I'm sure, decentralized cooperation.
Yeah.
Jacques, go ahead.
Yes, it is linked to my question. As a complement to what Sabine just said, I would like to ask, how do you see the role that decentralized cooperation could play in this framework? On what conditions decentralized cooperation could do something respecting the different criteria of TALD, in particular the indigenous one. So how do you see that, how the European experiences of local development can be exchanged, as you said, with partner countries? Thank you.
Thank you. And then last comment.
Yeah, just a short point on the risk. When we are supporting decentralization and local development, we are also supporting, in some extent, the risk for some centrifuge forces. would like to know your point of view about the risk on when we support decentralization and when we support territorial development. In particular, we consider a country like Lebanon, but it's not the only.
Yeah, there were a number of questions for you, Leonard, and for the discussants if you want to intervene. And then we maybe, please.
Actually, I would like this not to be a question and answer thing, because I thought that we should all answer each other. It's not just me. And I mean the issue of the size and the scale. It seems to me that this comes up as a first type of problem when you try to design planning systems, at the subnational level, and the debate has always been, what scale should we use, and I think that some sort of combination must be found between the economic potential of a territory and the scale at which this could be captured, and the administrative subdivisions, and there are examples of forms of joint institutions that deal with that kind of issues. More generally, it seems to me that at each scale there is a different set of problems that appear, and that there is no real complete continuity or indifference. When you move from one scale to another, you enter into a different domain. For example, this has to do with the centralization. There is a lot of difference between decentralizing at the regional level and decentralizing at local level. I just came back from Yemen, where they want to federalize the country and create 6 regions, and that is basically to reproduce by 6 the central state. They have no interest whatsoever in, they're going to compromise the perspective of local development, because under a federal system, the local authorities will be basically cut from the support that they now receive from the central authority. And this I would generalize, but this is my personal really view after many years of dealing with this. I'm really concerned about decentralizing at intermediate levels, particularly in developing countries. I see decentralization at intermediate levels more as creating hinges, administrative hinges where the state and the localities can talk to and can cooperate, rather than levels where you necessarily need another elected council. Because the minute you create regional authorities, this becomes the worst enemies of your local authorities. And when and if you want to promote development in the way we have identified, this is really bottom up. You have to look at resources and local resources, scale them as necessary, considering the nature of the resources themselves. But I'll give you just an example. In Vietnam, for example, in Vietnam there was a system until the last budget law in which districts were able to deliver development. They were receiving transfers, they were receiving resources, and they could and actually both the districts and communes. So what they were doing, they were going to their people and getting a lot of contribution, and $1 that was going down to the districts was raising $2 or $3 of contribution by by the people itself. The minute the decentralization empowered the provinces and made the districts, report to the provinces, all this has gone away, has disappeared. All the capacity to mobilize resources from the people and develop local potential has disappeared. And on top of that, as I was saying before, what happened is that now those regions are putting a lot of pressure on the state in terms of investments. A year ago, the Vietnam government was panicking because they were going to the market to get financing for their public investments. They floated $36 billion and they got 4. And at that point they got scared where this pressure was coming from the regions which have been empowered without a system of real control. So there are issues of scale. I agree 100% with you. There are issues of scale, but they must be resolved case by case. I wouldn't be able to say a figure. I think that Andres was very generous and courageous to say 50,000, but I wouldn't know if 50,000 is a good.
Yeah, 50,000 is a minimum threshold.
As a minimum threshold, yeah, as a minimum threshold. Yeah. Well, so this is debatable, but it seems to me that we should treat carefully this issue of scale and not generalize on.
Anything on decentralized
but
on the scale, I think that before I go on, we have 7 minutes, so please.
On the scale, I think we should not get obsessed too much with scale. I think it's counterproductive because it can happen at different scales and it can happen successfully at different scales. And very often we're going to have to work with whatever we have on the terrain. We cannot go and say this is axiomatically the right size.
Yeah.
Because it would depend very much on the countries. You mentioned neighborhood countries. In Egypt, you're going to divide it into regions because it's high density. You're going to have fewer regions with high population. In Lebanon, where you have division along ethnic, more religious lines, you're going to have much smaller regions, and that's going to be the situation in which you're going to work. On top of that, you can have within large regions in Egypt a lot of local development going in within regions that might have to coincide and be vertically integrated with regional development and national development strategies. Difficult context. Is this a better way or a worse way? I think it's probably a better way. Because if you're in Lebanon and you make, well, you can say that Lebanon's government is not powerful enough, but if it were, let's say prior to 1975, any sort of central decision is going to have a territorial implication and is going to benefit one community at the expense of the other. And that's going to generate tensions. Here the idea is that probably national government can be some sort of set up the guidelines where the decision making takes place within specific cities, regions, communities, whatever you want to call it. That might work and is probably more likely to work better than the traditional top-down central approach. The question is, going back to what you were saying, does that lead to centrifugal tensions? And here, probably it does. But is it better or worse than the situation before? Because if you have a top-down strategy that benefits core parts of the country at the expense of the periphery, you're going to have centrifugal tensions anyway. So probably, I'm not sure whether the outcome with this approach, the territorial approach, is going to be better or worse in that respect. Final issue, on the issue of development cooperation and establishment of partnerships. This is being done now in Europe, especially within countries with this smart specialization approach. In Italy, the national government actually asked the government of Emilia-Romagna had a fantastic smart specialization strategy to actually help places like Sicily or Calabria with their smart specialization approaches. Can this be done across countries and across continents? Of course it can. And it would be encouraged. I think there would be a lot of goodwill to do this, but if you incentivize this, you can get not just, I'm not saying transfer good practices, because that's not what you want to do. but good approaches to actual development and adapting those approaches to specific local conditions. There's a lot that can be done from there.
Thank you. I come from Flanders, and Flanders, when it has a cooperation policy, wants to imitate the national level better policy instead of benefiting fully from its regional perspective. So that's one problem. Last comment, maybe? 2 more comments and then we close up.
Sorry, just really quickly. I think what's interesting comparing Regio's smart specialisation and today is that even in Regio, they're not looking at a critical mass of a certain size. They're putting faith in the regions to say this is where there is indigenous bottom-up growth in various sectors, and they're sort of trusting the regions to choose the right places where they believe, where there's evidence to say that these areas are going to grow. Now, you can say, well, okay, but what if it's at the right edge of the country on the tiny islands, and is that actually the right place to have a high-tech R&D facility? Well, I mean, I'm taking a sort of raw example, but it is in the EU these smart specialisation strategies are more likely to be in urban centres because the EU is 72% urban. In other parts of the world, it's not the case. So it has a sort of, that has, I think, a different impact on how this bottom up sort of indigenous growth occurs. So I just.
Thank you. Last intervention.
Just like to share, because we are now working on this approach at Regio, discussing with the member states for the last 2 years. So just sort of few things that you might come up with if you go this way. And I didn't hear them before. One is that we receive very different feedback from mostly local authorities saying, in cities, like, wow, this is the best that ever happened to us, so why didn't you do this earlier? You have to understand that we ask for cities sort of delegations, so they need to now be involved in the programming, and they also need to have integrated strategies, but in general they already have that, and we're just waiting sort of to a more organized, integrated European approach, and to have more power to decide themselves on how that will be used. The other comment that we get is mostly from member states who say, well, are you out of your mind? What are you doing? Why are you doing this? Do you foresee all the problems? That's also managing authorities that tell us that. So I can very well imagine that from a DEFCO perspective, you go now to talk to other stakeholders, to go more into a local or regional dialogue. I'm not sure if you have thought about the national responses that you would get. Perhaps they don't plan it at all. Another thing is, on a territorial approach, I think there's a very big danger that it is also abused in the sense that, okay, this now means small money for everyone. We will give, saying that it's a territorial approach, to every village a couple of €1,000, and then everyone is happy, which is not at all what this should be about. It's really, I think you also need a territorial focus. My opinion, not necessarily on the biggest cities, but you cannot do it everywhere. There should be a sense where is this strategy needed, or perhaps already in place, and you need also a certain mass, probably with funds and with capacity to be able to make a success out of it. A community-led local development that actually has a long experience in leaders of rural development. They set a sort of boundary of 150,000 inhabitants, which is of course quite big, and something like at least €3 million funding to do something which can help do something with the strategies that you have.
To some extent.
Some scale is probably necessary. If not, you are doing probably other things. You do just project funding. You cannot really argue that you are trying to integrate or to implement a strategy. Some things which might be very European, but we are now having some difficulties with, is then how to measure this. It was already mentioned. The problem is, well, mainstreaming, yes, but the whole setup of the European regional development policy is still very sectoral. This sort of is adder, but you have to combine it, but it's now very much output and result orientated, which is good, but actually the only thing we ask for is sort of thematic results, sectoral results. So how will you eventually be able to argue that this integrated approach is actually useful or better? So this is something we really have to work on also the coming years and what we will do. And the last point is, might also be very European, how about this flexibility and control? If you make sure that you have the same procedures for a project that receives 20 million to a project that receives 5,000 euros, then you are sure that it will not work. It will kill every initiative.
Thank you. Well, I don't know if this is purely European, but okay. Good. I think you have it around at 1 o'clock. It's always a tradition here to respect the timing because you have many other things to do. I will not try at all to wrap up, but I think it was wonderful to have our different discussions and Professor Romeo here. Maybe just three or 4 points that I retain listening to all of you. First is that maybe we have somehow clarified the concepts. The concepts, because it's not only about territorial development or territorial approaches, it's also about decentralization. We discussed all these concepts and how they link to each other. So I would say we have made progress. But more importantly, second point is that I think we try to find a good rationale to move towards TALD. And I think there are many elements of a rationale. It's not fate, I would say. We have heard so many arguments, and maybe that's summarized well in someone who said the old paradigm has failed. The way we did it before has not delivered results. And the communication of May 2013 is all about empowering local authorities for better development outcomes. So if we want better development, if we want this, then we see the limits of the past approaches. The limits of spatially blind approaches, the limits of two-sectoral approaches, limits of drawing money in local investments, limits of the donors sometimes, which still remain very centralized. This is not working. I don't think this is fate. This is objective evidence. And Virginia, another argument of the rationale is that post-2015 is all about inclusive growth. And I think Anders was very clear that if you want to have inclusive growth, you better localize many of these dynamics. So I think we have been able here, in a brainstorming, to build a lot of elements of a rationale, to say this is not fate, this is something that is there, that is gaining momentum, is being mainstreamed, so we can also certainly apply it beyond Europe. Then I think we also discussed, third point, a number of conditions to make this work. And I think this presentation, you could not go fully into the details, Romeo, Leonardo, but well, that was time constraints. But I think there are many elements here which point to the conditions to make this work. We should not be naive. And some of the conditions is that it should ideally involve all territories, not in the same way, but we cannot simply go to a few territories. I think this point was clearly made. We need local ownership. If we do this as something that is imposed by consultants or by the national government alone, it will not work. So you also need local ownership, very clear point. You also need to build on the potential that is there. Let's not dream up things, let's build on the potentialities that are there in a given territory. And I think Leonardo very much insisted on the point that decentralization in itself does not generate development. You need some kind of a framework, nationally driven framework for local development. And there are examples of countries who have this. If you don't have it, maybe it's something for the future, but this is a key essential point if you want decentralization to be more than a political reform process. And finally, fourth point, I think we also touched upon several principles of implementation of this. Only principles, but that's good for the first discussion. Principles of implementation, just like, okay, piano, 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 and be very realistic, assess the context, where are we? All the countries are different, so we have to really do the assessment work. What is feasible in a given country, what is desirable, including issues of scale. Beyond context analysis, we really then need, to some extent, to see the windows of opportunities. And that was the question of Elena, is this all to be done at the same time? No, windows of opportunities. Where can we push? Bottom-up approaches, I think that was very clear. In many countries, we will not move with this mainstream thing here, with this fantastic scheme. We will have to go bottom-up maybe. I think these are some of the implementation processes. And then maybe the last point is precisely on what does it mean for us donors. And there I heard a lot of stories that the donors also have to be mainstreamed maybe, and have to be more open to look at how centralized their approaches are. Because often you're also very addicted to sectoral approaches, etc., etc., etc. So let's also try to see whether the donors can be more coherent in pushing this kind of agendas, not because we believe in it, but because it may generate more inclusive dynamics of growth and development. So I think we had a lot of elements here. This is just a quick thing, but I would like to hand over maybe the floor to Mr. Bagger to also say what next, because this is not the end of the process, it's the beginning. Voilà, Mr. Bagger, maybe to also conclude the seminar.
Thank you. Well, at this point, I don't think I have a lot to add to the summary conclusion that you have already drawn up. Indeed, the question now is about the next steps. And this is not any message at this point of time to communicate, except that we will go ahead.
You will be mainstream.
On this. Well, I think that there is a lot still to discuss, including the question of mainstreams, but I don't want to reopen the debate at this point of time. One thing is clear, is that now we have to go for more pragmatic, more feasible keys in order to start what we intend to do in terms of concrete action on the various territories. This is true that this will be small money, so the question is how to do as much as possible with the resources that we have, financial, but also in human resources aspect as well. Again, as I said at the beginning, I think we will have almost 6 months to start really developing the guidance with the hope that we can start really discussing with delegations for real startup of activities as from 2016. This is at least the best case scenario that we would like to see at some point concretized. It was a very interesting workshop this morning, I must say, very dynamic. I think we had the different frame. We had also a very good contribution from colleagues and from participants. I should not repeat what Oleg told me here 5 minutes ago, that we should try to organize this kind of seminar for management as well. But so I say nothing. But as far as this is there is life, there is hope. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.